So I'm showing the time as 12:30, and so it is my honor and pleasure to welcome you all to this final installment of the P&W series on race, racism, and anti-racism in the fall 2021 semester. My name is Karen Bishop Morris, and I'm happy to be your moderator for this series and today. We have dedicated the series to Glenn Ford, who was our inaugural presenter when the series began a year ago. Mr. Ford was the executive editor of the Black Agenda Report, and we lost him this fall. And we are so grateful to him for setting the tone for this series. I'd like to do a couple of things, just give thanks to folks who have made this opportunity possible. First of all, to Professor Deepa Majumdar, Professor of Philosophy at Purdue University Northwest, for inviting me and trusting me to be her partner on this journey. Also to Chancellor Keon and Provost Holford for funding this series. We couldn't continue this work without your support. To Chris Falzone and Rachel Pollack and Jamie Eggert, and so many names, too many names to mention, but you make the magic happen behind the scenes. And we are so grateful for you helping us to create awareness for the series. To the AV folks, Sharon Allen, Josiah Tipton, Brian Benjamin, Greg Collins, you answer our calls and emails and show up, and for that we are grateful. Thank you, Sue Brimmer from the Provost's office, and to Ann Gregory, the interim dean of the College of Humanities, Education, and Social Sciences, for your tireless support in making this series happen. And of course, thank you to all of you, audience members, those of you who are watching on Zoom, those who are watching the live stream on Facebook, and of course, those who are in person with Dr. Spector in SULB. It's been 18 months since the brutal killing of George Floyd, which was the spark and the impetus for this series. And in the wake of such injustice and brutality, I thought I would just share in this final sort of installment for today, just some thoughts about some of the victories, because it's important not to lose sight of hope and important not to lose sight of some things that have happened. First on my list, the Ahmad Arbory trial. Now, okay, I have some issues with the fact that Ahmad Arbory was not on trial, and thus we should not have be referring to it as such. But we should celebrate the accountability of those oppressors. I have been cautioned by friends of friends who've said, you know, let's not call it justice just yet, because justice is when a Black man can walk or jog or drive without fear. But we will celebrate the accountability. Second thing, I was reminded at my Thanksgiving table of the visage of Viola Desmond on the Canadian $10 note. If the name is new to you, Viola Desmond was sort of Canada's Rosa Parks, and her image has been on the Canadian $10 note since 2018. Folks waking up in Barbados today, some of whom I count among my closest friends, know that Barbados became a republic and has cut ties with Queen Elizabeth II, even though they gained their independence 55 years ago. So today there was a dazzling ceremony and celebration, and they swore in their first president, a woman, Sandra Mason. So there is hope, folks, on the horizon, and the bedrock of some of that hope is in our own backyard. Alan J. Spector. Alan J. Spector is professor of sociology and affiliated with the Center for Global Studies at Purdue University Northwest. I will read this from his bio. Quote, I went to my first anti-racist protest in 1963. Missed the MLK March. My mom thought it would be too dangerous. And then we found out that her 73-year-old father went. Throughout college, Dr. Spector was involved and worked for 5 years as a full-time organizer for SDS, an anti-war and anti-racist organization. He was a founding member of INCAR, the International Committee Against Racism, which for 30 years organized many community activities, including a New York Times petition opposing the racist genetic theories going around in the 70s, Jensen and Herrnstein and Shockley, Charles Murray, and so on, and activities in Boston for school integration, and too many to mention, protests against the KKK and neo-Nazis, including participating in the first multiracial protest to integrate Chicago's Marquette Park. I've been asked not to discuss the arrests. Dr. Spector sustained the in-car group at Purdue, Hammond, until it morphed into the Social Justice Club, which has been organizing against racism on campus and in the community for many, many years now, including sending volunteers to New Orleans after the flood, running a tutoring center in Gary, supporting immigrant rights and protesting killings by the police. Some of you know that Dr. Spector has taught the Race-Ethnic Relations, now Diversity course in behavioral sciences for over 30 years to at least 20,000 students. He has presented dozens of papers at professional organizations on issues of race-ethnic discrimination, and he is also a past president of the Association for Humanist Sociology, where they organized a conference theme around anti-racism. Anti-racism was also the focus of what many of you may remember was Dr. Spector's presentation at the annual faculty lecture at Purdue Hammond. Dr. Spector has organized a number of workshops at academic conferences on teaching race-ethnic relations from an anti-racist perspective, and more recently has turned his attention to international dimensions, including particularly India, where race, religious, ethnic, caste discrimination all converge as targets for major elements in the government and society. Without further ado, Dr. Alan J. Spector.
Hi. Is Mike working okay? I thought she was talking about somebody else. Just one thing on the arrests, short point. Don't eat the bologna. Like if the bread looks okay, you probably could eat that, but just don't eat whatever is inside the sandwich. Oh my God, some of you never had me for a class, so you don't get it. It's all right. Which way to start? Do I want to start with that or with that? Well, I'll start with that. Some years ago, a good friend of mine was in the process of being fired from University of Wisconsin for being an anti-racist. So we organized a big campaign around it, and someone came up to me and said, a white teacher, up to me and said, I don't understand why you so involved in all these things. I don't get it. And I said, well, if you were being fired, would you want me to support you? He said, well, yeah. I said, so what the hell kind of question is that? You know, why is that even an issue? What? So I think that what we need to understand is that when I use the word racism, I'm talking about a system, not just a psychology. That the system of racial discrimination goes all the way back to the importation of the slaves. And something that has been ingrained into the system doesn't just disappear because a civil war happens or because there's a Civil Rights Act that's passed in the 1960s, any more than any other ailment in the human body just disappears all at once. All right, I'm going to start off a little weird. So I flew into the airport on an airplane, and I saw the same thing I've seen again and again and again. And it really annoys the heck out of me, really does. And I think at least half the people in this room will get what I'm talking about. That is, while I'm walking down the hallway, past the restroom, the guys are scooting in and out of the restroom in 30 seconds. And the women are lined up outside, and they're all of about 15. And I'm thinking, who designed these things? Somebody obviously just said, let's make them both the same size, instead of saying, let's figure out how to move the most people the best way. Now, I suppose if I said that, somebody could say, oh, you want to give a special favor to the females by letting them have a bigger restroom. No, not giving somebody a special favor. It's called undoing a special disadvantage. But the point I'm trying to make is that while it's a disadvantage to the females to have to stand out in the hallway for 10 minutes, if the female is traveling with a male, he's just standing around in the hallway for 10 minutes. In other words, I suppose he's privileged because he gets to go in and out faster. But on the other hand, he's just standing there waiting. Also, he's just waiting outside instead of in line. So the point I'm trying to make is that I use different language than a lot of other anti-racists. For example, I don't use the word ally. I don't think white people should be allies because an alliance is temporary. An alliance is convenience. It's more like brothers and sisters or cousins or something, but allies, it seems to me, is too formalistic. Makes it sound like, okay, I think I'll make this decision. Well, God, you are a dead crowd today. Hope the folks on Zoom are laughing anyway. There are two kinds of mistakes people can make in understanding race ethnic discrimination. And I say race ethnic because we use the word racism. It's an imperfect word. Obviously, mistreatment of Mexican Americans, a mistreatment of Muslims in the United States. Well, Islam is not a race, and Mexicans are not a race. But the process, the pattern of discrimination parallels that of what has been experienced by Black people, oftentimes not as intensely, but nevertheless, there are certain similarities in the pattern of behavior. So the first thing we need to understand, and maybe this is pretty clear, is that there is such a thing as race ethnic discrimination in this country. And it is very serious, it is very severe. And anybody that wants to say, oh, you're making too much of it. Well, when people have a shorter life expectancy than other people, when people are forced to go to schools that are not the same quality. I remember several years ago, before the pandemic, there was a high school in Gary, Roosevelt, that didn't have heat for a couple of weeks. The kids were sitting in the classroom in their coats. And it's a public high school. And the public high school in Munster was giving kids laptops to take home to use for their homework. This is not a knock on the people in Munster. This is just trying to make the point. And somebody says, well, you know, why are the test scores lower? Why are the grades lower? Well, there's a reality. And it affects housing, it affects medical care, it affects life expectancy, it affects whether somebody's baby dies before they're 1 year old. These are real. This is not imaginary. And it's a mistake, sometimes I think intentional, to deny that reality. The other mistake I think that's made, though, is one-sidedness. It's a one-sidedness, which is to go around and blame all white people for somehow having ice water in their veins or whatever. And I have a problem with that. For one thing, it's not a very effective way to convince somebody to join a campaign, to say to somebody whose grandpa came over from Poland, it's your fault there was slavery in America. He's gonna look at you like, are you crazy? What are you talking about? I just get away. I don't even want to talk about this at all with you because what you're saying doesn't make any sense. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't distinct advantages that some groups have over others. But the use of the word privilege, we'll talk about that a little later, I think is a little bit problematic. Advantages is different than privilege, or maybe we're just dealing with words here. But there's 2 or 3 books I want to mention. The first one, which just came out recently, is also an audio book that I have my students reading, although some of them don't seem to be reading it. It's called The Sum of Us. And it's written by Rachel McGee. She's a Black woman and organizer in New York City. who's been studying it for a long time. And the point that she makes again and again in the book is that race ethnic discrimination clearly hurts people of color much, much more intensely, but it doesn't particularly help the majority of so-called white people. If you're first class in the Titanic, you might live a couple of hours longer than the poor folks who are in the lower decks. But you know, when the ship is going down, it's going down. And you know, unless you're a famous singer, you're probably not going to make it. She uses the term zero sum and says that zero sum in game theory and social science says that if you get this, I lose this. If you get this, I lose this. If you get this, I lose this. Monopoly is a zero sum game, right? One person's victory is another person's loss. And as long as people in a society, and particularly white people, see it as a zero sum game, more for them is less for me, more for them is less for me, we're never going to get near solving this problem. Now, I'm not simply saying that so-called white people, I have to use that term because, you know, there really aren't any white people, but so-called white people are morally damaged by that. Obviously, people are morally damaged by it, but that's not the point. I'm going to argue that people are materially damaged by it. Materially damaged by it. And I'll try to give some examples. The example that she uses in the book, a very powerful one. In many towns and cities, there are public swimming pools. Hammond, I know, used to have two, one in Hessville and one in Edison. Most cities had public swimming pools. And they were segregated, not necessarily in Hammond, but in many, many states, the pools were segregated. Black people were simply not allowed to use them. This was based on 1896 Supreme Court ruling, which said separate but equal doesn't violate the Constitution, except that if it's separate, it can never be equal. There's no way it's ever going to be equal. You know, you say, okay, we're going to give both groups equal. It never happens. And nobody has $50,000 to take the case to the Supreme Court, so it just sits. But in 1954, with Brown versus Board and with a number of other laws that were passed, it was established that while individuals could still discriminate and businesses were allowed to discriminate, this Woodmar neighborhood out here, when the housing first went up after World War II, they had advertising that said, you know, move out of downtown Hammond, move to Woodmar, you'll have your own lawn, you'll have a bigger house, and no blacks or Jews or Asiatics will be allowed to live there. And they just put that publicly, like on posters and stuff. So private discrimination didn't really get eliminated until the middle 1960s. And even then, it's not completely eliminated, but it is for anything that serves the public. But supposedly, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution said that governments could not discriminate. And so yet here were the cities and towns saying black people are not allowed to swim in the swimming pool. Well, when the ruling came down that said that you could no longer do that, what they did in many cities and towns was fill the swimming pools up with concrete and just shut them down. Now, the point of this story is that not only were black children denied the right to use a swimming pool, but now white children were too. In other words, how do they really benefit from all this? When one group gets hurt, both groups get hurt. My own personal experience with this years ago, when I was traveling I was in Florida, and there was a strike at the Florida Crate and Box Company in Tallahassee, Florida. And workers were making about $2.10 an hour, maybe a little less, I guess. And they went on strike for higher wages. And the workforce was divided, black and white, and they all went on strike together. the management of the company got on the phone, knocked on people's doors of the white workers and said, why do you want to hang around with these black people? Why are you going to let black militants control you? We thought you're a man. We thought you're a strong person, but no, you're being used. Well, that racist bull stuff worked. Forgot I'm on camera here. That racist stuff worked. And enough white workers started going back to work. Eventually, so many went back that the strike was ended and all the workers went back to work at the same low pay they had before. So how did it really help the white workers to fall for racism? It didn't. A more powerful example is from the 1990s, which is before most of your time, was when they reformed, changed the social welfare system. Now there's a myth anyway that said that a 19-year-old guy could just walk up to the government and say, give me money. That was never the case. Most of the public welfare was about for caretakers, usually women who had children and needed to make sure that they had medical care and food. Well, in the 1990s, they tightened it up a lot and basically required people to have jobs. Now, what that meant was people didn't have babysitting, so they had to put more pressure on grandparents or cousins or friends or whatever, and they were forced to go to work. The argument was, this is a big drain on the federal budget. All this money we're giving to these people. So this is going to help the budget. Actually, if you look at the numbers, that was nonsense. It was a very small percentage of the budget. It was less than 1%. But what putting all those people into the workforce did, and there was a lot of white women too, by the way, not just black, but putting all of them in did was it created a situation where the employers were now able to pay everybody less. Because once you had millions of other people suddenly desperately looking for a job, it made it much harder for even the existing workers to demand their rights. I guess I should be looking at the camera more. Oh well, not used to this. It was tens, probably hundreds of millions of dollars that employers saved by now being able to pay the existing workers as well as the mainly women who were forced into the workforce. That's where the money was made, not being saved in the budget. There's a book called What's the Matter with Kansas and another book called Dying of Whiteness. And both of these talk about how so many so-called white people are opposing medical reform and basically killing their own grandma because somehow the word welfare gets painted on it as if this is a terrible thing to have in society. And the same thing is true internationally. When South Africa had an extremely racist government, the workers there were being paid 1/5 of what workers were getting paid in the US. Ford Motor Company had a factory in South Africa. The government of South Africa was vicious. They took people out, they murdered them, they forced people to live in separate housing out in the desert. They had no rights at all. They were considered not citizens of the country. It was called apartheid. It was a terrible system. And it was also used to break unions and keep workers from striking. So Ford Motor Company had a factory there. And every so often they'd issue a press release saying, it's really sad that they have this terrible policy. But meanwhile, they were able to pay their workers 1/5 of what they were paying their workers in the US because those workers were unable to organize unions and strike. So it's easy to play the game without actually doing anything about it. There's a lot of money to be made on racial discrimination. If the family incomes of every black family in the US were raised to be equal to the income of every white family, just that, the entire system would collapse, or at least it would have to be tremendously transformed, which is another way of saying It's ingrained into the system. The example that I use sometimes is that of a person who has a pacemaker implanted into their body. You know, an older person that keeps their heart beating regularly. You could say, is that hunk of plastic and battery and wire more a part of their body than their hands or their eyes? And a simple answer would be no, of course not. Their hands and their eyes are their body. This is a piece of plastic. Except there's a sense in which that piece of plastic is keeping them alive. And in fact, if that piece of plastic stops working, they're going to die, and their hands are going to die, and their eyes are going to die. So there's a sense in which, if you want to play games with words, that person is no longer just a person, they're a pacemakerized person, so to speak. Because just like you couldn't separate Michael Jordan from the rest of his teammates, you know, we're all affected by the things around us. That's one of the keys to understanding sociology, is how you're made up of all the influences in your life. And similarly, the pacemaker couldn't exist if humans didn't have a need to build it. So it is with racial discrimination. It's right into the core of the political economic structure of every society on earth, by the way, not just the USA. It takes different forms in different places: anti-Muslim in India, anti-Arab in Israel, anti-indigenous people, so-called Indians in South America, in the Amazon, in the hills of Chiapas, Mexico, the Nazi attack on the Jews and on so-called gypsies, the tribal wars that we see going on in Rwanda and various other parts of Africa, the attack on Buddhists in Afghanistan, and on Hindus in Bangladesh and in China, where if you're not part of the ethnic majority, you're not officially discriminated against, but, you know, so this is a worldwide thing. I'm not just trying to go jump up and down the American flag, but we live here, and this is the place that set the pattern for it with the development of slavery. It's nothing that gets eliminated because we had a president whose father was born in Kenya and whose mother was an anthropology professor. That doesn't really accurately reflect the experience. And even in fact, if the president had come from the poorest of beginnings, the question is, have the life conditions of people really significantly changed? So, yep, there's such thing as racial discrimination, and it's severe and it's intense. And I think most of the under 30-year-olds, because I don't like the term millennium or generation X, Y, double Z, that makes me crazy. But certainly the under 30-year-olds, I think, get that. I think you get it more than my generation did. There's something else going on, which is maybe demoralization, where people feel like, yeah, you're right. You know, the system is really messed up. Whatever, I'll go look at some kittens on a TikTok video or something. That's not true for all, but that's clearly true for some. But as far as being questioned about the issue of it, I think people kind of get it. The problem is that the anti-racist movement can be distracted, can be hijacked, can be diverted away from the kinds of struggles we need to really change the system. And that means overcoming this idea that it's zero sum, that white people benefit at the expense of black people, or black people benefit at the expense of white people. I could bring Latinx people in as well. That's more complex, because Latinx people, Latinos, whatever word you're more comfortable with using, that includes my professor friend with blonde hair, blue eyes from Venezuela, and it also includes somebody who's picking tomatoes and living in the back of a trailer in southern Florida. So, but it's interesting because there is still this discrimination as well against other groups. Now we see the attack against Asian Americans in the streets because they were being blamed for the COVID crisis, even though COVID came to the US from Europe, went from China to Europe to the US. Overcoming the zero sum doesn't just mean me talking philosophically about or historically about a group of workers in Florida or whatever. It also means understanding how the opposite was true. For example, when I was young, there were tremendous struggles on campuses. The two most important were City College of New York and San Francisco State. And in both of those schools, hundreds and hundreds of students came out. And the campaign was led by Black and Puerto Rican students in New York, and it was led by Black and Mexican American students in California. But many, 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 many white students also joined in support. And the demand was to open up the colleges, because even though people of color were not officially kept out of those schools, there were admission policies that basically restricted who could go there based on the schools you went to, your grades, and this and that. They fought and they fought and they fought, and they had their heads cracked and they were arrested by the hundreds. But in the end, the universities gave in. And so we have universities like this one, for example, which is much more open than it was in 1946 to people of color, to students of color. But what's important to understand is that, for example, at City University of New York, once they put that into effect, the majority of new students that came in under that program were white. In other words, what raises one raises all. And the same thing is true with respect to the Pell Grant, which some of you are familiar with. The Pell Grant originally came out of the BEOG grant, and that was something that was fought for by people fighting for civil rights to benefit people of color who were being denied financial aid. And it's good, and it helps, and it enables a lot of people of color to go to the university. It also helps a whole lot of white folks that otherwise wouldn't have had that opportunity. There are so many other examples. There was a strike wave in the late 1960s, early 70s. Steel workers, auto workers, coal miners, postal workers. In all those cases, the leaders of those strikes were primarily Black workers. Historically, it's true, including coal miners, by the way. And those strikes won great victories, and the benefit of those victories went to all the workers, including the white workers. So this was the opposite of the Florida Creighton box story. And the war in Vietnam, which most people now concede was a mistake, that it was very damaging to the people of Vietnam mostly, but also to many people in the USA. Soldiers, 65,000 died, many, many more injured. Now it's generally conceded that there would have been other ways to keep that war from happening. But one of the things that brought that war to an end was, in fact, not just the student protests on campus. That was really secondary. I know, I was there. Mainly it was the rebellions by Black soldiers in the army who at a certain point said, why are we fighting this war? We don't get it. We're 7,000 miles from home. Just what's the point in this? Are we here to help some rubber company take over some plantation? So to a large degree, that's what ended that war. And as a side point, there have been a number of other big social movements that have popped up since the 1970s. Now, they already existed, but they were given great energy. I'm specifically talking about the women's rights movement, which some of you may have been familiar with, that big protest in downtown Chicago. The result of the struggle for women's equality was that women's pay was 60% of men 40 years ago. Now it's 80%. Obviously still discrimination, but obviously some kind of a victory took place. And the women's rights movement, the disability rights movement, the rights of older people, all of these things took energy from the fact that the civil rights movement demanding proper treatment, equal treatment for Black and Hispanic people. That's what gave energy to that, because it opened up the whole question of fairness and civil rights and who is being mistreated and who isn't. Now, there's this term that's used a lot, which I don't use, and gets me into trouble sometimes with the anti-racists. And it's sort of a semantic point, a language point, but it's one I hold firm to. And that is its use of the term privilege. I'm not sure what's meant by the term privilege. Obviously, there are advantages. There's an advantage to living to be 75 years old instead of 71 years old when you die. That's true. Although if we didn't have racism, we had a different system, we probably all live to be 90 or 95 as an average. There's a certain advantage to not being followed around when you go into stores. There's a certain advantage to obviously going to a better school where your parents are paying taxes through the nose to afford you to go there, or to have better housing, which costs a fortune in certain neighborhoods as opposed to others. And those are the big things. There are, the question though is, do white people walk around saying, boy, I really feel good that I'm making more than these other people? Or is it more like people saying, those people have it tough, thank God I'm not down there with them? So that I think that there is a responsibility. It's not so much a question of give up your privilege, because that's some moralistic stuff. It doesn't even mean anything. It's like going to church or something. It's more a question of, are you willing to fight, to risk what you have on behalf of your sisters and brothers? And that's really the important question. It's a disadvantage for most, not all, but for most white people to live in a racist society. It's not an advantage. It's not only Black people that get killed when a police officer decides to exercise poor judgment. Percentage-wise, not as many, but particularly working class white folks, which is basically most of you all, whether you know it or not, also experience discrimination. Anything that's anti-working class is automatically racist, because people of color are clustered more into the lower income sections of the working class. But it also harms the so-called white working class as well. It's not, is it a privilege to not be followed around when you're walking around in the store, which happens to a lot of Black people? Or is that just what your natural right should be? In other words, should not be a given that you're not followed around. So are we talking about someone who's privileged, or are we talking about someone who's mistreated? Is it a privilege to, let's see, well, let me give an example of somebody who will remain nameless, who was speeding through a small town in central Indiana called Delphi. And this person was pulled over by the police. And the officer didn't have radar. So technically, probably it wouldn't have stood up in court. I know a lot about the details of this, I just happen to know them. Anyway, the person was driving a late model, silver colored Nissan with a moonroof, Virginia license plates, no registration, and no insurance, because he had just gotten the car from his sister. The cop pulls him over, Delphi, Indiana, and looks at all this stuff and probably assumed that the person was running drugs, because why else would you have Virginia license plates driving through central Indiana, off the main roads? And then ran the person's driver's license and then said, okay, you can go. Now, I seriously don't think that would have been the outcome if the driver had been a 19-year-old Black or Mexican American student from East Chicago. It might have been. It might have been, but I don't think so. Or in another case, which I won't reveal the person's name, somebody made a legal U-turn. It was legal. The officer decided that it looked suspicious, pulled the person over, flashed a light on them, said, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this?" This was late at night, and then walked away, and then came back and said, "Oh, Professor Spector, I had you for a class 2 years ago. Okay, you can go." Now, we could say that's a privilege to not get a ticket. On the other hand, I didn't deserve the ticket anyway. It wasn't actually a privilege, except in the sense that it's a privilege to be whipped less than other people. I think we have to get away from that language because that disrupts unity. A better way to understand it are degrees of mistreatment. It's wrong and hurtful to deny that race ethnic discrimination is real and life destroying. But it's also wrong and dangerous to blame all white people. Now, this theory, gotta check the time here. Oh my God, okay. This theory was pushed heavily some decades ago by a woman named Peggy McIntosh. And the leading spokesperson for that theory now is a guy named Tim Wise, who spends a lot of time saying white people should feel guilty. Now, it is true, so-called white people should examine themselves for whatever racial prejudices they might have. That's true. But to talk about feeling bad and feeling guilty, it just reminds me of people who do bad stuff and then go to church. As if going to confessional takes away your sin and you don't have to really do anything about it. The anti-racist movement, to some degree, has been diverted and taken over by the top leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement. The top leadership is completely corrupted, making millions of dollars. The local groups, whether they're in Gary or Minnesota, Arkansas, Chicago, they're full of really, really good people. But the national leadership has made a brand out of it, almost a product out of it. There are people that make a lot of money giving talks to corporations about why they should give up their racism. By the way, when they said that there was funding for this speakers program, and it wasn't for me, which is fine, which is okay, which is proper actually. But all these corporations are making a big deal out of diversity this, diversity that. Sometimes they can't help but corrupt it, like a Martin Luther King sale on socks at Target or something. Like, really? That's a Martin Luther King fought for low-priced socks. But oftentimes they just try to emphasize peace and love and diversity while they still carry out policies. The same thing is true about universities. Universities make a big deal out of diversity. The school makes a big deal out of diversity. But the percentage of Black students plummeted in the last 6 or 7 years. So the question is, are you going to put your efforts where your publicity is? That's a modern way of saying, are you going to put your money where your mouth is? Are you really going to do something to affect change or not? Some people feel good about going to confessional. It's almost as if they say, I'm talking about white folks now, I'm not one of them. I'm not one of those racists, so I'm a good person. Well, if you have to walk around saying it all the time, then why are you saying it? Are you really trying to overcome racism, or are you just trying to do something that's called virtue signaling, where you're simply trying to show you're one of the good people on the right side of history? So, okay, you can, like, I admit I'm a sinner. However, at least I'm admitting it, so I'm better than the other sinners. You see how the game can kind of be played. It's dangerous because it takes pressure off of the real structures of discrimination. The large corporations, the politicians, the people that divide us, the people that mistreat us. And it's really not about being allies, like I said. Alliances are for convenience. It's about considering ourselves sisters and brothers. One of the important concepts in this book, The Sum of Us, she has a whole chapter called The Air We Breathe. And in it, she talks about the area around the East Bay of San Francisco. There's a town called Richmond. Richmond is an oil refinery town that makes Whiting look like clean mountain air by comparison. Air is absolutely filthy. And on all the neighborhoods closest to the pollution are mainly Black and Hispanic people. Same here, by the way. You don't find too many toxic dumps in St. John, do you? But the point they make is that while the cancer rates are high for people that live nearby, the wind blows that stuff over the white neighborhoods also. So the degree to which white folks don't stand up and fight for the rights of their sisters and brothers, they're hurting themselves. What's the expression? Cutting off your nose to spite your face. Let's see. Even on a question of things like education, you know, somebody who says, well, why should I pay taxes for the schools? I don't have any kids going there anymore. Well, maybe you don't, but maybe one of the kids that's in that school will go up to become a nurse that'll save your son's life, your daughter's life, your grandkid's life. And the same thing is true about people that go to schools that are poorly equipped or that are seriously stressed in one way or another. What is the potential? What is the potential for society that's lost by depriving or mistreating one section against another? So I think an effective movement against racial discrimination certainly requires that people understand that it exists, and certainly requires that people oppose it and examine inside themselves if they have any prejudiced ideas. But it also requires understanding that it's a continuum. It's not a dichotomy. It's not like there's this group and they're fighting for something, but that it's in the material interests of white people to stand with their sisters and brothers, just as it would be in your material interest to take care of your sister, your brother, your real sister or brother if they were in need. Why is that so complicated? Why does it have to get all mixed up in stuff? And there are people on both sides that seek to divide, and that becomes a problem. Racist discrimination is real, but if you want to destroy it, you have to follow the money. Who is benefiting from it for real, as opposed to looking for a quick and easy solution? Just one last point, which I've harangued my students on this a lot. Also, I'll leave you with this also, which is that I've been to a lot of stuff in my life. I was, going way back and this and that and the other thing. I would say in all of it, including protests of 500,000 people in Washington and immigration rights marches in Chicago of 500,000, this and that, I had never, ever, 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 ever seen anything as profoundly important as the protests after George Floyd was killed. The reason why that was so important was because so many of the other things that took place in society, anti-racist protests, anti-war protests, women's rights protests, involved a lot of people that were already involved in that movement. But the protests about the murder of George Floyd involved so many just plain old regular folks who had never been to a protest before. I would not have imagined in my wildest dream that there'd be a protest in Crown Point, in Whiting, 250 mostly young people, probably half Latinx, maybe a quarter white and a quarter black, marching together down the street in opposition to what had happened in Minnesota. So I think that there's a tremendous amount of energy that exists among the under 30-year-olds, and a tremendous sense of, no, I don't want to be a part of racism. It doesn't work for me. You're insulting my friend Joey, shut up, that kind of thing. But there's also a sense of confusion. I have an expression I use, a zero isn't the same as nothing. Nothing means nothing's going on. Zero means it's a balance that averages out to zero. Kind of like when the air gets really still before a storm, or if you have people doing a tug of war and it happens to be balanced for a minute, you wouldn't say there's nothing going on here. You'd say there's a lot going on. It just happens to not be moving now. And I think that's what's going on in the thinking of a lot of people in this country. It's not so much that people don't think about this. It's that they're confused and don't know where to turn. And what it will take to change the system is not talks and lectures by people like me. And it's not even simply reading books, although there are some important books you should read. It's actually going out and doing something and not demanding that you get an immediate result from what you do. Because the results you get happen in the long term. You never know the impact of what you're doing. You may never know the impact of what you're doing, but if you do the right thing over and over and over again, believe me, you'll have an impact. I know this from students that come back years later, decades later, and talk about what they've done. That means people have to get active and involved in movements. Doesn't have to mean you go there and you burn down a police station, but it does mean that people need to involve their lives in the lives of other people with modesty, without having a know-it-all attitude, but understanding that every person is a person like you. Every person is a living, breathing, laughing, crying, thinking, feeling person just like you. And therefore, we need to have confidence in each other, and we need to go out and be active and not necessarily demand a pat on the head every time we do something right. So I'll just stop and I'll take any kind of questions anybody has. Microphone.
All right, so you mentioned that we need to go after the people that benefit from it, right?
Mhm.
But what about the system, like you said, what about the socioeconomic system that allows those people to flourish the way they do in the first place, i.e. capitalism?
Well, I mean, those people who know me know that, I mean, I wrote a whole book about why capitalism fails. You know, I think I tried to make that point gently. I tried to make that point gently when I said that the system was so ingrained, it was inseparable. It was inseparable at this point. There's no such thing as racism without capitalism. There's no such thing as capital. There could be on paper. On paper, I can imagine a capitalism that's not racist. On paper, I could imagine, but you got to figure out who's making money off of it. If someone isn't making money off of something, it's going to die. For example, remember spinners? Well, somebody made a lot of money off of it, and now who cares? Or the Gangnam Dance that was like big 7, 8 years ago, 10 years ago. In other words, when a fad fades, it disappears. But when something continues to benefit, and I think the benefit has to do with primarily the money that's saved by paying people differentially on the job and by giving people fewer social services. And until that's addressed, and it's not going to be easy, it's like trying to play Monopoly with different rules. Good luck with that.
And one more question. This will be quick. What is your opinion on democratic confederalism? Do you think it could potentially make a good alternative to capitalism? And where do you think would be the best place to start implementing it? The best places?
You better explain to the audience what you mean by democratic federalism.
Okay, so democratic confederalism was this societal economic structure that was thought of by this, he was this Kurdish activist or freedom fighter type person. I forget his first name, but I know his last name, Oklatan. He based it off of the writings of Murray Bookchin, and it's sort of a structure that, you know, there's no representative democracy. Everybody like has a hand in contributing. It's like all communal.
I think that the until the economic structures are changed, the political structures can't be changed. In other words, we can rearrange things as much as we want, but if somebody's holding all the aces, it doesn't matter. A good example of that is in Italy in the 1930s, where there's a fascist government. And one of the things that a lot of local people tried to do was set up cooperatives. So they set up cooperatives and groups of people got together and they farmed together and they built things together. And then at a certain point, the government said, we had enough of this. And they sent the army in and they smashed it. So until there's a confrontation that deals with these big questions, I think that these attempts at, you know, I think that someday in the world that may happen, but I think that it's not realistic to think that that could happen now in the absence of a mass movement and a mass struggle.
I have a question.
Yeah, sorry.
Is it okay? Can I ask a question?
That's somebody on there.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm sorry. This is totally weird. You know. Go ahead.
Because you're an academician, and I hear everybody is arguing over semantics about critical race theory. Okay, so are you for revisionist history, or and if you are or aren't, I'd like to hear that. And at what age do you think that students should be introduced to American history?
People should be introduced to true American history, which includes the anti-working class nature of much of American history, which includes the racial discrimination. They should be introduced to that at about 6 months old, as far as I'm concerned, because it's a reality. Now, most of what's called critical race theory is completely misunderstood by the people who toss the word around. Basically, critical race theory doesn't blame all white people. It does exactly the opposite. It says it's systemically built in to the structures of the system, and it comes from that. It is true that the 1619 Project, which is connected to that, I personally think it makes a small mistake. It says, and by the way, the woman who wrote that has backed off from that mistake. But initially, she wrote that white people came to America in order to do racist stuff. And she's since backed off from that and said, no, the racist stuff happened very shortly after they got here, but that wasn't their main purpose in getting here. But beyond that, I mean, no, you know, you don't want to, there's this myth that's being pushed, particularly by conservatives, that there are all these teachers taking these 8-year-old kids, white kids, and standing up in front of class and saying, you horrible person, you're responsible for slavery. That doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. I mean, maybe there's some psycho somewhere that says that, but that's not happening in the schools. On the other hand, if it hurts somebody's feelings to know that Thomas Jefferson did rape his slaves, well, sorry it hurts your feelings, but that's just reality. And the highest form of respect you can give somebody is to tell them the truth, actually. And the biggest insult you can give somebody is to pat them on the head and say something that'll make them feel good. So I would say early on, I don't think that people should be shielded from truth, because if you hide the truth from people, and later on they find out the truth, they're going to be real mad at you for lying to them all those other years. There has to be a way to do it, obviously, that's sensitive, that people can understand. But no, I would say, you know, early on, without a doubt.
So can I present the chat questions now, or are there more live questions?
A live question.
Okay, go ahead.
So I do like that you have your own unique approach to race and racism. A few times you referenced white people as so-called white people.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? Can you explain that a little more in depth?
Sure. To recap a little bit, again, what I do in class, so apologies to those of you who've heard this before. There were no white people 1,000 years ago. There were no black people 1,000 years ago. When I say that, people get confused until I say there were no people in Indiana 200 years ago, because there was no such thing as Indiana. So there's no such thing as white or black until the development of capitalism. I'm not saying there weren't tribal fights. There may have been all kind of tribal fights, but the notion that skin tone was somehow connected to your worthiness was not an important idea. Maybe some random person had it in ancient Rome, I don't know. It was not an important idea. So I say so-called white because it's just my way of saying so-called white, so-called black. I mean, the black population, most of black people in America have a significant amount of white ancestry. More white people than no, by the way, have recent black ancestry. I say recent. Everyone's ancestry comes from Africa, like 50,000 years ago, but that's a different point. I mean, even recently, large numbers of Mexicans have African ancestry within the last 200 or 300 years, but in Mexico, they just stopped taking account of it. The interaction, the interconnections, 2/3 of Spain was controlled by Muslim Arabs for hundreds and hundreds of years. Why do you think there are so many Latin American young men who are named Omar? Omar doesn't come from ancient Greece. Omar is an Arabic name. So I think that we come from the same place. It's not simply intersectionality. I don't like the term intersectionality. That implies we come from separate places, we intersect. We came from the same root. We spread out and diverged, and we've been interacting ever since anyhow. It's highly likely that people from Africa went to South America, for example, before Columbus. So I say so-called white. I purposely toss different words around on purpose so that the words don't have too much meaning. I'll say African American. I actually like Afro-American myself, but that was because that's what Malcolm always used. When we say black, or we say people of color, it's a way of saying we're not tied to this word. We're not going to have a fight over the word. We want to deal with the reality. So I say so-called white. Sometimes I'll just say white people. Sometimes I'll say people of European ancestry, as a way of not trying to solidify it as a concept. It's a social construct, political economic construct that was created out of thin air to serve a certain purpose.
So, Dr. Spector, I have a couple of chat questions to ask you. This is Deepa. You may not be able to see me. Yeah, you can see me on Zoom. So here's the first question. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. We've seen some chat comments really appreciating your presentation. But the question is, could you please talk a bit more about how we move towards more successful cross-racial organizing and collaboration towards racial justice? And I have a second question, but if you could first answer the first question about moving towards more successful cross-racial organizing and collaboration towards racial justice.
Well, okay. There are different groups on this campus currently in hibernation because of Zoom, but hopefully to be activated again in spring, was a social justice club. That's one example. And when it was set up, those of us who set it up said, this is not going to be another one of these like liberal white people's groups. This group is going to have to be multiracial from top to bottom throughout. Otherwise, it shouldn't exist. It's based on an equality of relationships, not just equality in words, but based on people working together on a variety of things. There was a study done actually by some Purdue people some years ago that was partially correct. It said that the racial attitudes are overcome by contact. And I think that's somewhat true. I think that a lot of so-called white students, if they go through 4 years at this school, they come away with a clearer understanding of race and less racism than when they came in. Not because of what you get taught in class, but just because you have to borrow a pen from somebody. You're sitting near somebody. But that study was since expanded to say that what really makes a difference is people working together on a common problem. It's not just having contact. So again, I mean, I don't want to, just advertise to one group, but they did everything. We did everything from sending people to Haiti after the earthquake to New Orleans after the flood, and to Munster, by the way, also after the flood. Protests on supporting immigration rights, supporting more Black student admissions at school, against a racist professor who no longer is here. He can sue me if he wants, but the shoe fits. And before your time. And a variety of things. They washed 1,200 pairs of shoes to be sent to a charity down in Central America. You know, all working together is really what builds unity, because you're all going to leave here someday. And some of you are going to be school teachers or social workers or work in business, or maybe work in one of the allied medical fields. And it's really important to be active and not necessarily demand, as I said, a result. I mean, one of my former students is an SEIU organizer in Chicago now. I haven't talked to her in 10 years, but you know, people are not afraid to go out and do stuff. And remember, if you're doing it because you want a pat on the head, you're doing it for the wrong reason. You should be doing it because this is your brothers and sisters. So, you know, Social Justice Club, like I said, what it was involved in before the campus was basically shut down was a variety of things. We were just trying to get involved with a tutoring center in Gary. It was a combination of community service stuff, but also genuine protest activity when it's called for. The killing of young Vincent Smith, a Black high school student in Gary, who was shot in the back by the police, and the cop got off. The kid was running away, and they weren't even going to put him on trial till we had lots and lots of protests about it. Then the prosecutor blew the trial and let the cop go anyway, but at least it created public awareness. If you're smarter tomorrow than you were yesterday, then it was a good day today. That's how I view a victory anyway. So there is that. There may be other organizations as well. It doesn't take stance on politicians. It takes stance on issues. You know, you can join political groups if you want also, you know, whatever, that's your own business. But this is focused on fighting against social injustice, which has to mean putting the struggle against racism in the front, but also arm in arm with the struggle against the mistreatment of women, mistreatment of immigrants, mistreatment of people with disabilities. They're all interconnected. It's just that none of those other struggles will ever get anywhere as long as there's racism in society. When people say to me, what about climate change? Isn't that a bigger problem? I say, yeah, climate change is a huge problem. It really is. You're all going to deal with a lot of stuff in the next 40 years, believe me. However, there'll be no movement successfully against climate change unless there's a movement that takes racism head on, which also means dealing with capitalism, like he said. Because if you don't do that, you're just throwing stones at airplanes.
There's one more, thank you, Dr. Spector. There's one more question, and actually more than one more question, but I don't know that we have time for all of them. This question is, what steps should we take to improve race relations in our schools and community?
Well, I don't know how many of you are from Maryville or know much about it, but I know that in Maryville, they did have some clubs that dealt with these kinds of issues in the high school. I think it was called Stand, something like that. And the guy who set it up actually had been here for a number of years, working in the TRIO program. And then he went to work in Maryville. Again, I would say activities. Even something like taking a group of students to Chicago to go to the Mexican National Museum on 19th Street, or going to the Art Institute, you know, walking around looking at buildings, going to the Museum of Black History on Cottage Grove on the South Side, hanging out together, talking about things together, but also fighting against injustice. I mean, on this campus, I'm not exactly sure how it happened, but Black student enrollment dropped by 28% in 1 year. That ain't right. I don't know how to say it in terms that are not intellectual, but you know, and there's a very interesting book also called Racism Without Racists. in which the writer points out that all these processes take place, even though the people don't understand that the impact is a racist impact on society, even if the person doesn't have a racist idea in their head. So I would say that it would be important. I think that when teachers are trained, because a lot of teachers are now getting trained and taught. Keep looking there, and I should look at the camera. A lot of teachers are being trained and taught to be respectful of different racial ethnic groups, and that's fine. But it takes more than just a sensitivity training. It really takes organizing activities together. You know, on this campus, if a Filipina student and a Black student and a white student and a Mexican American student are all sweating about, will we pass the anatomy exam so we can get into the nursing program, and they study together, that goes a long way. And I'll also say, so does hitting the streets. Hitting the streets if it's called for, you know, as young people did after George Floyd was murdered. Maybe some of you even, I would guess. Getting involved in protests, getting involved in petition campaigns, and building organizations. I know there's one at IUN also we're going to try to connect to. So anyway, I don't know if that's much of an answer, but I think that a lot of it depends on teachers.
Sure. Thank you so much. So I'm going to end with thanks to all of you in the audience, a clarification and some announcements. The clarification is that all of us from PNW, the faculty members who have volunteered their services in this series beginning from last fall, have been doing it on a volunteer basis. Just so you all know, none of us are paid for this, and we don't even expect to be paid. We're doing it for the love of the cause, which is anti-racism. Because I believe there's a rumor floating that some of us are getting paid and others are not. That's absolute nonsense. And Dr. Bishop Morris and I have spent hours forging this program, and we have done it with a dedication that, speaking for myself, I don't think would be there if I were being paid for it. Where we are very grateful to Chancellor Keon and Provost Holford is for the money they have given us, the funding they've given us for paying honoraria to external speakers. So that's the first, that's the clarification I had in mind. But I also have a big thank you for Dr. Spector and a big thank you to you all. And an announcement, we have a full program for spring 2022. And I'm going to share screen and share this program with you so you can see it for yourselves. And I hope there's a registration link that was sent this morning to those of you who are from PNW. Once the flyers are ready, I will be emailing the flyers to those who've registered. And I hope you will for sure join us in spring 2022 as well. So the first item in this program is on January 18th, 2022, an interview of Dr. Leonard Harris by Dr. David Detmer from PNW on his work. The title is Necro Being, Worst Form of Racism. The second item is a sort of a conversation with Tim Wise. It's a two-day event, Feb 22 and Feb 23rd. Feb 22 in Westville and Feb 23rd in Hammond. And again, once these flyers are ready, I'll be sharing them with you. March 1st, there's an event called Racism, Being Colorblind and Beauty. And this is a joint presentation. Professor Miko Yamada is from PFW, Purdue Fort Wayne, and she'll be speaking about the colorblind aspect of it. And I will be speaking about the subjectivity of physical, our sense of physical beauty and how we transition from that and move towards inner beauty. I'll be using Plato to present that. On March 22nd, we have Dr. Niti Parashar, who will be speaking about racism in the STEM fields. The title of her presentation is From Barriers and Biases to Belonging, Lessons from a Female Physicist. Very interesting. And so she will be speaking on the STEM fields and the systemic kind of racial biases that exist there. And then we will end with, on April 6th, with Professor Kim Sipes and Vince Emanuel, who's they're both ex-Marines, and Vince Emanuel is a former PNW student. He's an alumnus, And so the title of this is The Racial Face of War. And so this is going to be on April 6th, 12:30 to 1:45 p.m. It happens to be a fact that almost all the wars of the US have been fought against people of color. And so they will be exploring this international aspect of racism. And so I hope that you'll all join us for spring 2022 and really make this event as successful as it's been in the fall. Thank you again so much.
One last quick announcement,
Yes.
which is actually, I'm teaching a whole course on this in the spring. It's called Diversity and Race, or I forget the title of it. It's Sociology, 310, 9:30, Monday, Wednesday. And it'll be livelier than this, trust me. We'll have outside speakers, we'll have films, and we'll try to go into this in a lot more depth. So if any of you are interested in it, feel free to sign up. If you don't take the course, but you're wandering around campus at 9:30 on a Monday or Wednesday, feel free to just come in and sit down. I don't care. Good with me. So, it's basically Sociology 310, race and, what is it called now? Racial diversity or something like that. In any case, so anyone in Zoom land, anyone on Facebook Live land, or anyone here, you're welcome to sign up for it if it fits your schedule and fits your interests. Sociology 310. There are two of us. There are two sections of it. The one that's being taught here is by me. So.
And our events next semester are mostly Zoom synchronous, with the exception of the Tim Wise event, which is going to be hybrid. So you're completely welcome to join us. And Dr. Spector, if I can read to you in the remaining, I mean, we're already out of time, but if I can quickly read out to you all the thank you notes. Thank you, Dr. Spector. Thank you. And then thank you, Dr. Spector. You provided quality insights. Thank you. It's a really powerful series. Thank you, Dr. Spector, for this insight. And then there's a link that's been attached to that. I feel smarter today than I did yesterday from listening to you, Doctor. Thank you for your time. Thank you for presenting today. I learned a lot. Thank you so much for this excellent presentation and discussion. So yes, many thank you notes towards you. Thank you for taking time to volunteer your services today and share your insights and your expertise.